All my biology stuff from A-level. Hi guys, so since my last A-level video 1 year ago where I said I wanted to start my A-level series, I never continued it, and so I was thinking to myself, it's about time. So I think today I'm going to share with you guys what I think I did to get an A star in A-level biology AQA. I think A-level biology was really hard. I really struggled through it. In general, I just found it a really difficult subject to grasp, especially with time management and how much content the subject actually had. There's 8 major topics, and I think it really is a really heavy subject, especially in biology. Like, there's all these like specific keywords. Hopefully some of the things that I share with you guys today are things that maybe you do already know, but hopefully give some reassurance to what you're doing and maybe some new ways of how you could tackle biology. So I made some notes. Oh, it matches my... So I think firstly, the way I learned content, obviously you have classes, and I think for me, classes weren't as helpful as learning from the textbook. So my main textbook was this A-level biology exam board AQA book from CGP, and honestly, if you're studying AQA biology, I think the best textbook is genuinely this textbook because it has absolutely everything you need, but shorter and more concise. My school actually gave me a massive, huge textbook, so I think getting a good textbook and basing most of your learning from it is really important. What I normally did was I would learn from this textbook. I would treat class in school as revision of the topic, so I never made like really pretty notes or anything in my textbook in class. I just scribbled down things that I needed to reaffirm my learning, and I never spent time making pretty notes. I know sometimes if you have like really nice notes, it's nice to look back on, but for me that was never practical. The only practical thing I did was I made a bunch of cue cards. I made cue cards for every single topic and every single thing you could possibly find in A-level biology. Obviously they're not in order right now. Let me show you guys my cue cards. So I would write the topic on the bottom. So this is neurons, so I wrote neurons on the bottom, so if I ever drop my cue cards like what I did at the beginning, then I can just put them back together. And then I wrote the question as you do with cue cards, and then the answer at the back. And I think for cue cards is that I made them like pretty much straight after learning the topic from the CGB textbook. So I would write down like questions and really break down the topic. It really doesn't matter how many cue cards you end up with, so even if you end up with like loads and loads like I did, it's actually easier and a lot better to break down the questions and to make it shorter so that the answer on the back is also shorter, although this looks quite long. So yeah, I would read the textbook, learn from the textbook, use class as revision, make cue cards, and then base my learning and my memorization from the cue cards. So I talk a bit about how I used my cue cards. For cue cards, what I think is really most important is that whatever you write on the cue cards should be as close to the exam's mark scheme answer as possible. So later I'll talk a little bit about how I use past papers. But for cue card, when you're making the cue card, you can always add to the topic. So say if I made a topic for neurons, I would first use the CGP textbook, which does use a lot of exam terminology, and of course you also need to actually know the topic in order to do past papers in the future. But I would base most of my cue card answers on the CGP textbook, and then I would use past paper mark scheme answers, and I would write exactly the mark scheme answer on the cue card. So if something's like, okay, for example, how does myelination affect? So I would look at mark scheme answer from a past paper, and then I would use those keywords in that answer and write it on my cue card. That way I'm not learning about myelination in my words, but I'm using the words that AQA biology exams actually use, and that way it's just so much more simple, and it'll actually help you a lot when you come to do your exams, because I think especially for biology the mark scheme is so specific, and sometimes you use certain words that are correct but it's not right in the mark scheme. So that's why I think it's really important to use past papers when you make your cue cards. But of course, when you first learn a topic, you wouldn't have looked at the past papers yet, so you can add those cue card answers in later on. I would do my cue cards every single day without a fail. So I did the timed repetition, based repetition method for cue cards. I didn't exactly follow it that strictly because I think for the spaced repetition is like day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, but I found that I always forgot more than I remembered. So say if like by 3 months into second year of A-level, I have this amount of cue cards, then of course I probably can't go through the whole stack in one day, but I would maybe go through 3 topics. And then for the topics which I feel like I don't know the answers most to, I would repeat that same topic the next day and then do other topics as well. I really think with cue cards is about consistency, and sometimes what I found helpful was that for the cue cards that I didn't get correct, then I would put them on top of the pile and redo only those, because you do have a limited amount of time for revision, and so you can't possibly go through the whole stack again. And some of the questions are really simple and maybe I do know the answers, so I wouldn't bother going through those answers again. So for example, 3 factors that affect the speed of conduction is myelination, axon diameter, and temperature. If I'm doing the neurons topic, I probably know this already, so I wouldn't bother repeating this cue card. But when I was first making the cue cards, I had to make this because it formed the basis of like my foundation to the neuron topic. And so it's really just about discretion and what you think you need. So yeah, I based most of my memorization on cue cards, and it really does look like a lot, but if you do it a lot and frequently, it really does help, because I think for cue cards, it forces you to really think about the topic and to remember and to memorize. And so I just found this the most useful. And I also read aloud the cue cards as well, so I made sure that I was listening to myself talk, and I think that was quite helpful. And if you have friends who can test you on your cue cards as well, then probably that would be quite beneficial. The next thing I wanted to talk about is like a fact sheet or like a mistake sheet that you can make. So what I mean by this is, so I didn't make this, my senior did, and he very kindly gave it to me, but basically just like 1 page of notes, the topic on the top, and then the things that you commonly get wrong at the bottom. So I did this for myself as well. There was just always certain questions in biology that I would get wrong. So if I noted them down on one document, then I was less likely to get it wrong. So if you see a pattern with which questions you get wrong, you should always note them down. And also with this sheet is that you can also put very common questions and answers that pop up. So it's basically just something you can always refer back to. And so each time you do a question and you make a mistake that you know is a reoccurrence, you don't just ignore it and brush past it, because those are important marks. So just a very simple 1 sheet for each topic I think is very beneficial and will help you to organize what you know and what you don't know. So for my fact mistake sheet, I called it exam question tips. I had like a general section about read the stems carefully, use the stems, link it to the question, use the diagrams during calculation questions, look at how many marks it is. These are things that I found I always got wrong or I had difficulty with. That's why I noted them down, and obviously it'll be different for everyone, especially when I said mention whether the respiration is aerobic respiration or anaerobic. Respiration by itself is not sufficient. For the mark scheme answers, I always needed you to specify whether it's aerobic or anaerobic, and I never did, so I always forgot that. So that's why I wrote that. Things about standard error, research methods, ethical issues, random questions that I always got wrong, like calibration curve questions, and then I just put the mark scheme answer underneath it. And this biology tip document actually helped me a lot with coming to closer to the exam. So that's on top of doing the cue cards. So cue cards for base knowledge and memorization, and then a fact sheet for specific exam questions that you get wrong and terminology that you just need to remember. Okay, so for past papers are the most important thing in biology ever. For me, once I revised one topic using my cue cards and I felt like I memorized it enough, I would do some past paper questions on that topic. So you find loads of resources online. I'll list them down below of just packs of topic-based exam questions, and I would just scroll through all the questions without doing them first and then look at the mark schemes, and from there I would pick out key exam terminology and I would note them down either on my cue card or on my fact sheet, and that way I would familiarize myself with the types of questions that pop up in this specific topic. I think this is really important because you need to be familiar with what things they can ask you about, like for example respiration or photosynthesis. It's always the same things. So if you just scroll through the exam questions, you get a broad idea of what is going on. So after scrolling through, then try to tackle some specific questions. I always like to go for the 6 markers because they require obviously a good knowledge of the subject, but also what you find is that sometimes, for example, if they ask like what is aerobic respiration or what happens in respiration, say if it's 6 marks, you find that they will recycle that question, but the mark scheme will be slightly different, and that's why we have to be very careful to pick out what's actually in the mark scheme and then note those differences down. And then when we come to the real exam, we write down every single possible answer that we saw in the mark scheme. And so that's why I think past papers are really useful, because biology is just very weird in that the mark schemes just never match up, and it's very odd. But I guess the exam technique is that you just go through every single exam question to do with that topic, look at the mark scheme, and remember what comes out of the mark scheme. The catch here is that you should never just base your learning off mark schemes. So like I said, there's a process. So use your textbook, use the classes, use cue cards, and then come to past paper questions and mark schemes. And that way you're building up layers of knowledge, and it will really help you for the real exam. I think closer to exam time, I did about at least one biology past paper a day in time conditions, and then mark it thoroughly at least maybe an hour or two later. I do think the more exposure you get to past papers, the easier the questions will become, and you'll also be able to kind of spot patterns of questions in biology exams. So obviously there was the old spec and the new spec, but you find that the old spec questions are very similar to the new spec questions. So I used both specification exam papers, especially once I started to run out of past papers, I would use the old spec ones. The thing about past papers is that you should never try to save past papers, because even if you do one paper, you won't remember all the answers in the paper. You can redo that paper. So that's what I did quite often, especially for the newest papers, so like say 2021, and also the specimen papers. I redid those a few times, and I looked at what score I got at the end of each time, and that helped me to see my progress. What is better than doing loads and loads of past papers but not remembering what answers you gave for the questions is doing the same few past papers multiple times until you get your target grade or above. So I always redid biology papers and tried to aim for at least an A star. Okay, wait, that's the highest. Yeah, I tried to aim for an A star, and if I got the A star, then I would move on to another past paper. To maximize your use of the past paper, make sure that when you come to mark your exam, so you do the past paper, you mark it on the front of the exam paper or on another sheet of paper, you write down the topic of the question, and then you write down the mark that you got for that question. So then by the end, when you've marked your whole paper, you can see what topics you did, what mark you got, and then look at which topic you lost the most marks on, and then work on that topic and maybe pull up the topic past paper questions and then do those. And then if you refine that, then next time when you do the same question or similar questions or the same paper, you'll be able to get marks in that area. And then once you've done a few past papers, you can see what your weak topics are, and also say, for example, do you always lose marks on math questions, or do you always lose marks on respiration? So in terms of when to do past papers, I think as soon as possible is good. Obviously, if you just started A-level biology and you're like 1 month in, maybe just looking at past paper questions on that topic would be quite beneficial. But I think what is important is that you know that there's plenty of past papers, and that you can do past papers as soon as you think you have the knowledge, or even if you don't feel like you know the topic really fully. As long as you have something to write of the answer and you kind of know the topic, then you can build up your exam technique from doing the past paper and then looking at the marks. And make sure that you're very strict with yourself. If your answer isn't what the mark scheme says, if you didn't use those specific words in the mark scheme, then don't mark it right. Just be harsh on yourself and you'll thank yourself later. Okay, next tip that I have is reading the specification. The specification is so important. The reason for reading the specification is that sometimes the exam questions that they ask, the answer will directly be worded in the same way as the specification says. This is particularly true for definition questions. And so if you use the specification, you highlight the specification, you look at what the definitions in the specifications are, and maybe learn straight from it as well. That really benefited me, and it also made sure that I knew every single topic and every single small thing that they put in the specification. Obviously, it's in the specification for a reason, and so just reading through the specification at least once. I read through it a couple of times during my A-levels, and especially before the exam as well, just to kind of consolidate my knowledge, I guess, and kind of see where everything fits into biology. Some other things you can use is that AQA has this subject-specific vocabulary that I just downloaded from their specification. And so this just has words like accuracy, calibration, errors, anomalies, uncertainty, but it basically gives you what they define that word as for A-level biology. And so if you see that word in the exam, you know exactly what they're looking for. And this is especially helpful for maths type questions and statistical type questions. For example, it talks about precision being Precise measurements are ones in which there is very little spread about the mean value. Precision depends only on the extent of random errors. It gives no indication of how close results are to the true value. So if your exam comes up with something about precision or definition or anything like that, you know what they mean because you read this one. So really just looking for the specification, looking at what they have is quite helpful. Another tip is in spare time, you can listen to explanations of certain topics online, especially after you think you've learned a topic. Then finding random YouTube videos online is actually quite helpful because they explain the topic in a different way, and that will add to your layer of understanding. And this is especially helpful for when you come to do your A-level biology essay. The essay is the 25 mark synoptic essay where you need to draw concepts together and relate them to the title given, and this is in your third paper. I honestly found this so difficult, but what can make your life easier is reading their mark scheme criteria. So this is just online, I'll link it below as well, and their marking guidance. They have a very detailed marking guidance, and I read through it and highlighted and looked at what they wanted, and this is kind of how I approached my essay. In terms of essay specific tips, my biggest tip is that just learn your topics well. If you learn your topics well, then your essay will go well. And personally, I generally don't think I put much extra knowledge within my essay. I personally would say don't stress too much about it. You can do further reading in your own time, so like read the bigger biology textbooks. Just listen to what your biology teacher has to say. Often, more than not, your biology teacher will be the ones giving you extra information that you don't need for your exam, but you could use for your 25 mark essay. So kind of try to take advantage of that and maybe ask them questions about extra things in class, and then that would help to build up your knowledge for the essay. But in terms of the essay, the only preparation that I really did was just to know my content for the core biology really well, and then to write with a very clear structure. Think of writing your essay as if you're writing your personal statement, so short and concise. Know that the examiners are reading a lot of these, so make sure that you write it in a way that is not too difficult and not too hard to read, but it's just like straightforward to the point, and that you actually link everything to your title, and that every single paragraph of your essay has a purpose. And that way I think it shouldn't be too big of an issue. Another thing I wanted to talk about is the statistical test. So I found the statistical test in biology so hard, and so I made a sheet of all the statistical tests and how to do them for biology. So as a free resource for you guys, I will attach the statistical test document that I made below, and hopefully that will help you guys somewhat with tackling the statistical test portion of biology. Oh, there's also like this sheet called Statistics in Biology Further Guidance, and it talks about the kind of statistical tests that you use, so this would be quite helpful as well. I also had a document for all the biology 6 markers that came up, so glucose, bacterial cell, just everything that came up. I just copied and pasted it into this document of all the 6 markers. I found this really beneficial because 6 markers will always come up, and the mark scheme answers are, like I said, quite different, and so if you can refer back to it easily, then that will really help you in your revision. Alright, now about like random tips, although I feel like I've been giving random tips the whole video. In your spare time, like if you're on the bus or something, or if you're just like walking, brushing your teeth, I did this quite often. I don't know if it's a good thing to do, but it definitely helped me, is that I would just randomly test myself. So for example, if that morning I learned about hemoglobin, then maybe like throughout the day I would just randomly ask myself questions that I had learned about in the morning. And this goes to do with repeated learning and like memory, spacing, repetition type thing. Or even like on the bus, you could do a random Quizlet that someone else has made. It's always good to use more resources than your core resources. So I would say in the bigger picture, my core resource for revision was past papers and my personal cue cards. And then on top of that, I would do a bit of reading there and there in class. I would do some Quizlets. I would listen to some videos online. And those are the ones that would kind of help me to smoothen out my knowledge on one specific topic, but I didn't base my learning off them. Another random small tip for diagrams for label this is that whatever you see in the textbook, you will not see in the exam. In the exam is always going to be a weirder and harder to like understand picture. So that's why doing the past paper questions and looking at the diagrams and labeling them and seeing if you get them right is really important, and it will help you to familiarize yourself with what the picture could actually look like. Okay, so I think those are my major tips that I have for biology. But overall, in general, the thing with biology and with A-levels in general, it really is just about discipline and repetition. Doing at least a little bit each day. So what I'm doing now in university is that even if I have a busy day, I would do at least a little bit of revision in the morning and a bit in the evening if I know that during the day I'm quite busy, like with other commitments that isn't to do with studying. And I did that in A-level as well. Revised every single day, and I tried my best to learn as much as possible, especially during the half terms and the holidays. Those are the most crucial times because there are the times where you can consolidate your knowledge, get ahead, and then you'll thank yourself later as well. And I think with A-levels is that if you just tell yourself you're going to work really hard for these 2 years or however much time you have left, you can really relax and be free during the summer holidays. In terms of balancing like biology with my other subjects, I think I tried to do a bit of biology at least every day. Like I said, I did my cue cards every day and that was my main revision for biology. But obviously you can't just rely on cue cards and that's it. So at some point you have to move on to your past papers. This is like the first time we've had sun in like a few weeks, but yeah. I hope the tips were somewhat helpful and good luck with your A-level biology ventures, and I hope that your exams go well. And I think the next A-level video I will do is on psychology. Have a great day. Bye!